Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. As a reminder, the Responsible Edge is a show about marketing practices that not only achieve results, but do so with integrity. And today, I have to admit, I was in awe in many ways and absolutely delighted to be joined by Amber Skinner-Jozefson, who is the CEO and co-founder of a platform called ePOP, which is a fintech business focusing on retail data analytics and eliminating paper receipt waste. So really, really interesting space. Amber's got 20 odd years of working in fintech sort of space and tech in more generally. And she is an amazing speaker, orator, inspiring woman, had a really, really interesting career, started in journalism and then moved into corporate communications and marketing, and then ultimately into leadership roles. So really, really great guest to have snaffled and to have managed to come on to the Responsible Edge. In terms of the conversation itself, we actually focused our conversation, once we'd spoken about Amber quite some length, on Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO and founder of FTX, and his 25-year sentence for corporate malpractice, which I think is one of the longest sentences for a white-collared crime ever committed. So it was an interesting take from Amber on that sentence and some of the lessons that can be learned and drawn from in terms of the case itself. Amber was also brilliant when being asked for her bit of advice that she would have offered to her younger self. There's a particularly interesting and funny particular example that she shared with us. So just want to say a massive thank you to Amber for giving us her time this morning. It was brilliant to have her on. As always, guys, if you've got any questions, thoughts, comments, etc. for Amber, please feel free, or for myself, please feel free to add them to our different platforms. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Enjoy the show. Thank you. Amber, thank you so much for agreeing to join me on this Friday morning and join us for an episode of The Responsible Edge. I really appreciate you giving up some of your time to come on.
My pleasure. This is actually a whole range of topics that I'm super, not just passionate about, but I have lots of opinions about. So I'm really excited to get into marketing, responsible marketing, social impact, communications, and how all of this is interwoven with business from top to bottom. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
As am I, and I'm sure our listeners are equally as intrigued and enthused by the prospect of us managing to snaffle you as a guest to come on the podcast, because I think what would be really cool, and I'm feel free to go back to wherever you want to start, but we always want to start an episode by understanding as much about you and your background as possible. We literally have had some guests who have been like, right, it all started at the age of 5 when I, was interested in X and Y and Z. The degree to which you go back is up to you, but just want to hear more about your history, really.
Sure. I guess for the purposes of this podcast, let me start by saying that I am a marketer. I'm a marketer at heart. I've done lots of different, actually, no, that's not true. I've not done lots of different things. I've done mostly communications and marketing in telecommunications and financial services. I'm American. I went to school in the US, but moved overseas pretty quickly. Always do. I started my career as a print journalist. So I was a newspaper journalist by training, and that was how I started my career. Moved pretty quickly into corporate communications and into marketing. Like I said, mostly in telecommunications and fintech, at financial services, then into fintech. The last big company that I worked for before moving into startups was Swift. So cross-border payments. And actually, most people don't know Swift has about 12 different business lines, from fin crime to working capital markets to cross-border payments, which is what we know Swift for. So I was global head of marketing communications there before I had the opportunity to jump to a smaller startup. And it was a kind of startup scale-up pivot in the consumer lending space here in London, where I live now, and very FCA regulated, as it was a consumer lending company with a pivot into technology. So utilizing and leveraging technology to perform alternative credit scoring outside of credit bureaus. So very immediately applicable to markets where there are no credit bureaus, helping lenders figure out how to assess credit worthiness and propensity to repay, but also really relevant for markets where there are credit bureaus being notoriously opaque and discriminatory, not really understanding how is my credit score calculated? How do I move up or down? How does this work? So credit bureaus being notoriously opaque. From there, so I started there as chief marketing officer, and then I ended my tenure as CEO. And then I moved to a new company where I am co-founder and CEO in the retail technology space. So really, it's data and analytics around consumer spending behavior at a very, very granular level. So this company is called ePOP, which stands for Electronic Proof of Purchase. And really what we do revolves around the digital receipts. So on one hand, for end users, we're a digital receipt provider, and we ingest digital receipts in a variety of ways. One of the most popular ways that we found is via email, where you get your email receipt to your inbox, and then you lose it, and it doesn't mean anything. You just keep it there and you kind of lose it. So if you forward that to us, it comes in an app and it's all centralized in one place. From that email receipt, and from also connecting with POS at POS point of sale with POS providers and systems, we see a whole load of transaction information. And from that, we can glean, a 360 view of consumer spending offline and online, back offline. Again, we see everything. So what we do know is retailers have a very, very good idea and a very good view of how inventory moves within their four walls. As soon as a customer steps out of their particular business, though, they don't know what happens. But I know what happens because I see all of their receipts. So and I'm talking, somebody leaves Starbucks and goes across the street to buy a croissant at, Pret. So I can see this journey, the 360 view and the spend down to the SKU level. So loads of people are after SKU level data, forecasters, data aggregators, retailers, card issuers. There are loads of use cases, from security, preventative fraud detection, to, retailers being able to better serve their customers, stay in touch with them. So here, I run this company with my two co-founders, but I consider myself, and forever will consider myself, a marketer at heart. That's a long answer to your question.
That was sensational. I mean, I feel like you've to go ahead. I was wondering before you were introducing yourself, I was like, I wonder how she's going to nutshell like the breadth and the depth of the experience that you've had. I actually am gonna have a question taking you back to the very beginning of your career though. You started as a journalist. Was it? Can you just talk about that? I think that transition from journalism to marketing, like, I know it was corporate affairs, I think you first went into after being a journalist, but just talk us through kind of what was that trigger, or that kind of inspiration, if you like, from moving from journalism to corporate affairs and marketing.
Sure. It's very practical. The motivation was, I need to make enough money to eat. That was really it. So I'm 40. I graduated from journalism school at a time when, before social media was a thing at all, it was still like Facebook was still at specific campuses. So it wasn't even a national thing, let alone an international thing. But converged media, which is what we called it at the time, which was like basically news now available online, and the business models were all different and changing. Like huge swaths of daily newspapers were closing across the US. It was a very, very sad time for traditional journalism. I graduated right in that storm with a degree in journalism. So I worked as a journalist, but on the side, I was serving pizza, and I was working 7 days a week doing two jobs. And that's just how I could survive. So the motivation really to move to corporate communication was, all right, I need to actually now have a degree. Like, I need to make this work somehow. I cannot be working two jobs forever and still making very little money. But it was something that was a huge regret for me for a really, really long time. My motivation going into journalism school was like, I'm going to be the next Emily Wax. Like, I'm going to be a foreign news correspondent. I'm going to be in the middle of war zones, and I'm going to bringing the truth to the people in the form of print journalism, and that's my mission in life. So switching to corporate communications, which if you're a journalist, it's kind of the dark side. It's a little bit different now, as all of these things are a little bit mixed up. And one could really be the other, and it's not so clear. But at the time, it was definitely like, this is on the side for freedom and freedom of speech, and the other side is shilling for a company. So it really was like moving to what was considered the dark side. So I had a lot of regrets about that for a long time. Now, looking back, I absolutely love marketing. I absolutely love communication, and writing, and being able to write and tell a story has been super foundational. And not just my marketing career, but as a CEO, as a part of an exec co for different organizations, it's been foundational for investor relations, for tons of things.
That's really, I was hoping that you were going to explain that. I love how real it was, that at the time it was that kind of practical reality of life, if you like. And then actually, and let me ask you this. It sounds like I loved how you described like that sort of passionate intention with which you envisage yourself as that foreign correspondent on the battlefield, bringing the truth to the people. Has that, you mentioned like now you look at marketing, you look at comms, and you look at the impact that it has, and I think what you're alluding to is that you feel like there's real impact that can be had there as well. Just kind of reflecting on what the Responsible Edge podcast is all about, etc., and dovetailing that in. Can you just talk about how you found that kind of what, I know this is thrown around too much, but how you found that why, if you like, in moving into marketing and corporate affairs?
Yeah. So at the beginning, I struggled with what marketing and corporate communications within a business was meant to be. Like, what is this role meant to do? Which is to help the company to achieve their objectives. And so I struggled with that for a little bit. I would come up against managers saying, no, we can't. What are you? We can't say this. Like, this strays too far from the company line. So I struggled with it at the beginning.
Were you seen as a bit of a maverick, coming with your sort of intention for telling the truth, and people are going, whoa, Amber, let's dial it in a little bit.
A little bit. It was when I was really junior. It was more like, my foundation is I'm a writer, so I'm a content creator. So that's been the foundation. So it was like, you need to change this story a bit, and these are the talking points. And so, okay, as a writer, you say, all right, fine, I'm adapting this. This is the feedback that I'm getting. This is how my editor wants me to edit this. That's okay. I can do that. That's not a problem of can it be done or not. It was more like, gosh, now I need to be really intentional about the kinds of organizations that I'm joining, because this is the role. This is the role. I got more used to it, as in, this is what marketing does. This is what corporate communications does. But it was the types of organizations that I work for. I need to be really intentional about what they're doing within the context of the world and things that I value. So it was a transition for sure. But when you're young, certainly when I was young, I wasn't aware of. I thought, I had everything to learn. So it's like, oh, this is how the world works. This is how this particular profession works. Okay, I'm either going to get with it or I'm going to change. And it was something that I really enjoyed, and especially the writing aspect, I really enjoyed and could build on top of. But it was, it was a learning curve for sure.
Interesting. I feel like I could literally spend an entire episode like talking to you about your background, which, I mean, whether or not we manage to snaffle you for part two, will wait to be seen after having to sit through a conversation with me. But got two other questions I wanted to ask you. One that's slightly playful, one that's a little bit more serious, if you like, in terms of your background. You perfectly sort of began to introduce ePOP and the work that you've been doing, on the development of that business. And I'm fascinated by the kind of transition from CMO to CEO, which I know was at a previous startup, but that area, which again, perhaps we don't have time for today. But here's my question for you. In terms of ePOP, what was the, like, talk us through like the inspiration moment, if you like, or talk us through those kind of observations of pain points or of like, you know, customer need essentially, or motivation that led to, hold on a minute, this needs to be done. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that the idea, actually this idea was a while ago. It was a while in the making before we actually launched the company, and it was actually my two co-founders. So the three of us worked together at a previous company that was New York based. One was kind of head of M&A. The other one was head of international business development, and then there was me doing marketing internationally. So we all worked together pretty closely, and everyone was traveling a lot, especially those two. And it was a question of just practicality, which is the way that most startups get started. You know, those ideas, those entrepreneurial ideas, is I have a problem, I cannot find an immediate solution. Fine, you know, I'll just create my own. I almost cursed there. Forget it, I'll create my own.
Feel free to. We're an X-rated podcast in that sense. Feel free to curse away.
Good to know. So it was like, you know, mountains and mountains of receipts, and then I don't remember what yeah, like expense platform we were using at the time, but it was essentially taking photos, but you still have to keep the receipt because they need to be stapled to something and submitted physically to HR at some point. So it was like mountains and mountains of receipts. This doesn't make sense. Why do we even have paper receipts still? And then, so my two co-founders who were traveling a lot had this pain, and then digging into it, it was like, oh my God, I had no idea about the I want to say side effects, but just how toxic receipt ink is. And this may be common knowledge now. Certainly is common knowledge in the kind of the circles that I run in now. But paper receipt ink is awful. It's a carcinogen. It's very toxic, and because of that, receipts can't be recycled. So 100% of receipts are thrown away and they're not recycled, and they're toxic, and the ink leaches into groundwater. Like it's terrible all the way around. It's terrible for humans to touch. It's terrible for the planet, from production to, you know, disposal. It's awful. So that added a huge layer on top of this, what would have just been like, oh, okay, we need a better a way to expense you know, transactions and take care of receipts. That added a huge layer on top of things, especially for my co-founders who had a head start in founding the company and saying, oh my God, this needs to exist. Actually, why do paper receipts even exist anymore? Let's go on a mission to eliminate that altogether, which really brought in the environmental sustainability and climate impact part of our company, which is like from top to bottom. It's very pervasive in our company today in terms of the folks that we work with, the types of businesses that we support, which 99% are small, sustainable businesses. So folks from, you know, athleisure wear made from recycled plastics, to refilleries, to organic grocery stores, to you know, plastic-free bars like shampoo bars, soaps. I mean, lots and lots of different types of ways of getting at and helping to reduce our footprint, humans' footprint, and making sustainable alternatives more mainstream. So that was the beginning of it. It started with a pain and has really quickly mushroomed into a oh gosh, what's going on with this planet, and how do we do our part in trying to reduce the impact that humans have on the planet as it relates to retail and consumption, which is just a tremendously huge problem and very burdensome for the planet.
And would it be, Amber, and I love how, yeah, we normally don't jump into kind of like the guest's kind of proposition, if you like, so early on, but it is fascinating and we've gone there. What so just so I'm clear, is it from an environmental perspective, a sustainability perspective, let's call it more broadly, is ePOP's like intention, if you like, to obviously realize a paperless world when it comes to receipts, but equally to connect customers with vendors, retailers, etc., that have that sustainability and responsibility at the heart of what they do. Is that the package?
Yes. So
Okay.
we have a community that we run that's been growing really quickly called B1. So it's b1.community. And there we have sustainable shoppers and sustainable merchants. And the shoppers, it started as a community of shoppers. And I was really at the beginning, because I'm a marketer, trying to figure out what would be of value. I knew what they were there for, but what did they want to consume? So I was doing, green challenges. I was doing research. I was giving content marketing, I was giving ebooks, things like this. And they very, very quickly told me, we don't want any of that. This is not what we're here for. We want, very practically, the sustainable alternative to Lululemon or Amazon or this. I'm looking for this. I want a plastic free this. So I was like, okay, let's go get that. So that hence started the quest to find and help elevate these sustainable alternatives to everyday things. And there are amazing sustainable alternatives to everyday things. The users on our platform are not, I would say, the archetype is not the eco warrior. It's who's composting everything and is just like, can fit all of their trash into a one jar. That's not the archetype. It's really people who are wanting to fold more sustainability into their everyday lives. There are a lot of parents who have school-aged kids who are learning about climate change and that are coming back and saying, well, what are we doing as a family? And they're like, oh shit, okay, well, I need to do some things and we need to change some things up. Equally, there are just lots of young people who this is a no-brainer for them. And I mean, maybe we'll have time to talk about it, but I love young people. I love this like Gen Z generation. They're amazing. And there's no having to convince them that climate change is real. That, this is a no-brainer. And they're like, hey, we want to shop independent. We want to shop people who have our values in mind. We want to shop things that are unique, not mass produced. Or some of them are like, I have some things that are mass produced. I do still shop at H&M and Zara, but I want to give these clothes, I'm reselling this on Vinted, or I'm trying to make a difference. But this is just like folks who want it to fold sustainability into their lives in a way that's that's doable for busy folks who maybe live in urban settings. So it's like, I live in an apartment, I can't compost everything. What else can I do, right? So it's that community of folks, and it's growing really, really fast. I'm surprised at how fast it's growing.
That's so cool. I mean, that's so encouraging to hear. Like, with something of the mission that you guys have got, that community is growing. It's almost like, I mean, I was coining the phrase in my mind as you were describing it there. It's sort of making the sustainable life accessible to all, isn't it? It's making it something that you can incorporate into what what otherwise you might be, as you say, too busy to do these sorts of things. But using ePOP is a way to realize that.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Nice, very nice. I had one more question about you before we move on to actually the basis of the conversation. It's a slightly playful one. You're obviously have been for quite some time like a global marketeer, working on, well, not just marketeer, but you've been working on global markets, etc. But as an American now living in the UK and operating in the UK, can you talk us through any like noticeable differences that you see in the way that marketing and comms essentially plays out in the US versus the UK?
Yeah, for sure. I don't even have to think at all about the answer to this question because I still remember, it's been 10 years that I've lived here. I was in France for 5 years. Before that, I was in Asia for a while. So it's been a while since I lived in the US, although I've worked a lot with American companies and I am American. One of the things that struck me right away in London when I arrived 10 years ago was advertisement on the tubes. So not only is kind of the syntax a little bit different because it's British, different to me. Not only was the syntax and the verbiage a bit different, turns of phrase are a bit different. There are lots of, vocabulary words I know, but I would never use that in this way. Yeah, so things like, tariff instead of plan, just things like that, that it's like, oh, that's interesting. But one thing that was really noticeable was And I didn't understand at first. There's lots of advertisement and a lot of just commonly known things around think like not talking to strangers. So like not striking up conversation. Or I remember an ad that was saying like, is there anything more awkward than catching somebody's eye on the tube and having to like awkwardly look away? I uh, I'm pretty gregarious and extroverted anyway, but also I'm American, and that's not something that makes sense or made sense. That's not a
Mm.
common thing in America of like, don't talk to strangers. So, I mean, probably a stereotype of Americans is that we talk a lot to anybody, anywhere. And I didn't realize that that is unique to America and that is annoying and awkward. So when I arrived in the UK, that was one thing. There was a lot about how awkward it is, the train journey. And so for
Mm.
me, I would think this is just annoying because the trains are always full, and this is an annoying. It's hot. There's no air conditioning on trains in the UK. I mean, a couple lines do, but like not the Northern Line where I live in London. But in the tube, lots of things about how awkward tube journeys are because you've got to navigate how to be stereotypically British, which means quite reserved, very rule abiding as well, and
Mm.
not engage with anybody beyond like the absolutely necessity, which is sorry I bumped you, like oh sorry excuse me, please go
So
ahead of
true.
me. And that it took me a while to understand that because that permeates a lot of marketing and advertising in the UK, which just doesn't. That's not the same as a cultural kind of broad value in America.
Is that Amber? Can I just, because that's fascinating. Is it in terms of like the directness of the messaging? Is that are we a little bit more reserved in terms of sort of the way in which we approach kind of the messaging that we include within our marketing and advertising?
Also, yes, there
Okay.
were some concepts that don't that are not that I did not immediately understand. Like, you know, don't it's weird to strike up conversation randomly with strangers. Um, Things like there's a correct way to do weather speak, which is you cannot disagree with people when it's like, oh, isn't it nice today? And you can't be like, no, it's not actually. I don't like this weather. You can't do that. There's a lot that is unspoken in terms of communication in the UK. So
Yeah.
things like saying, it's fine. That does not mean fine. It took me years to figure that out. So there's a lot in terms of subtle communication cues and just culturally, it's yeah, one thing. Yeah, Charlie, I
We
would say
sound
is
we
directness.
Amber, as you describe it, I'm just thinking we just sound incredibly confusing and difficult to read and not open at all. I think we need to pull a bit more of our American cousins' way of doing things into things because it sounds utterly bamboozling in terms of the way we approach things. Brilliant,
Luckily, there are
Amber.
some books about it, though. There are some books that have been written. One famous one that all American expats are kind of given in Lent is called Watching the English. So there are
Okay.
books about it.
Great stuff. Well, for any of our listeners who are US based, thinking about possibly migrating over to the UK, it was good, great bit of advice there from Amber. So thank you for that, Amber. Amber, as I said, I feel like we could just literally do a full episode on you and your background. But let's move on to talk about the article that we kind of shared with you before the show as a sort of a topic of conversation. Would you mind by just kind of introducing us to that article in the FT and kind of what the nature of what was covered?
Sure. So the article really is around the saga of FTX, and its founder and CEO Sam Bankman-Fried. So FTX is a cryptocurrency trading platform. They also have their own altcoin, and the spectacular crash of FTX. And and by spectacular crash, I mean like huge customer losses, a lot of shady business practices that we'll get into that resulted in a crash, not able to cover customer deposits and customers pulling their money out, freezing of the platform, criminal investigation, and Sam Bankman-Fried was just sentenced to 25 years in prison. I think he's like 30 years old or something, and I don't think it's done quite yet. So it's been a spectacular rise and a spectacular fall of this particular platform, which throws into question, a lot of things around the industry, the cryptocurrency industry as a whole.
Which I want to get into, but I want to start off. By the way, that was brilliant. I mean, yeah, the synopsis was perfect. I've got one set up in front of me, and you pretty much verbatim introduced it, which was perfect. Before we want to go into lots of things here, but I want to get your sort of CEO hat on with this, especially CEO of a fintech business yourself. Let's talk a little bit about like leadership and effective or ethical, responsible leadership, and just reflecting upon the FTX scenario situation. Like, what are your kind of main observations in terms of? I mean, there's the very obvious, but just in terms of the way in which things went so wrong in their kind of C-level setup.
Sure. Well, I followed this story relatively closely, not just because it was all over the place last year, but because of what seemed to me as the CEO of a fintech startup trying to survive the worst fundraising downturn since 2008.
Mm-hmm.
To be just, it seemed like a completely outlandish story. Like, WF is going on, seriously. At least that's a perception. The opaque world of cryptocurrency has been shadowed, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least it's a perception, despite more mainstream use cases having emerged with banks, with central banks, with different financial services providers for cryptocurrency, and different stable coins and different internal coins for moving money cross-border, etc. There's more use cases, but in general, cryptocurrency is a very opaque world that's been operating in shadows with very little regulation. So this crash, this scenario, as you call this FTX scenario, oh gosh, if I summarize what I understand to be some of the headline accusations and some things that really, there's a lot there. Like, this is a rich story, and I should, it should be, I mean, it's obvious, but let me just say that I am not a lawyer. I am just I'm a CEO. I'm not, so this is my understanding and what I've really retained from following the story through most of H2 of last year, 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things that I that are just egregious to me. One is allegations of market manipulation. So Bankman-Fried and FTX have been accused of engaging in market manipulation, particularly in the realm of cryptocurrency trading. Critics, there are lots of things that have alleged to have been done in their trading practices that contributed to market volatility and unfair advantage. So that's one that's like, okay, wow, market manipulation. There were obviously big regulatory concerns. So for the lack of regulation of cryptocurrency markets and trading, there's still some regulation that you have to adhere to. I ran a FCA regulated, small, very small in comparison, but there's still, you have to follow some rules by law, which they didn't. So there was a lot of regulatory scrutiny in like a number of jurisdictions over concerns with compliance in financial regulation. Some things that we know to be very, very standard. Anybody who's opened a bank account in the last 10 years. So things like adherence to AML, anti-money laundering, and KYC and onboarding, know your customer, as well as like security laws. And I know there's been a whole conversation in the US and elsewhere about what is cryptocurrency? Is this a security? Like, what is this asset? So, there are just some basic laws and adherence to compliance that wasn't done. And then the third one was this huge perceived or real conflict of interest. So Bankman-Fried's dual roles as CEO of FTX and the head of his sister company, which is basically a hedge fund, Alameda Research, which was an associated cryptocurrency trading firm that has raised concerns about potential conflict of interest. I think they took like a whole load of money from one to cover FTX customer losses, all under like the cover of darkness. It appears to be like just an absolute complete mess. That's a long answer. Does that answer your question?
No, that was Amber. That was brilliant. And by the way, I love the caveat that we don't want to get into any legal trouble. That was brilliantly poised. But let me ask you specifically. I mean, those are great observations in terms of the things that went wrong, and I think you used the term egregious, which I think is a brilliant term when looking at this. In terms of thinking about leadership and thinking about the impact that leadership has upon either getting it right, and you've alluded to some of the the customers and clients that you're working with through ePOP, like you're working with people that have like a genuine focus and energy going into hopefully doing the right thing and building these businesses that are geared towards sustainability, etc., etc. So positive leadership in that sense. Like thinking about this case though, and thinking about your own experience, like how does this happen? Like what's your observations on how this goes about happening, and thinking forward about perhaps the cryptocurrency market, perhaps fintech more broadly? How do we mitigate this sort of situation happening again?
So I'll talk specifically about entrepreneurs because that's what he is, right? He's an entrepreneur that had a huge rise and quick rise. And I'm an entrepreneur. I work with a lot of startups. A lot of my friends and contacts are entrepreneurs as well, who are building businesses now or have built businesses. This kind of the ecosystem that I exist in right now, amongst others, but it's really an entrepreneur and startup ecosystem. And that is like that there's not one size or one demographic for an entrepreneur, but there are some common traits. And it really it spans. So you can have, and we hear stories all of the time of folks who are brilliant technically. They're brilliant. They can build something quickly. They understand financial markets and complex systems really intricately, and can build things that are highly valuable and useful. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they have people skills, that they have management skills, that they have leadership skills. That doesn't necessarily mean that. When you find somebody who has both, wow, that's a unicorn, and that's amazing. But as probably as an ecosystem, there's not a huge emphasis on the transition from entrepreneur to leader. There's just not. Sometimes it happens very, very quickly as well. So when and there is no kind of regulation. There's about who can be an entrepreneur and then who gets to be CEO. And there shouldn't be, because these are private companies and they're often very small, and hopefully they get large, but often they're small and they stay small. So, there's more industry pressure coming from VCs, right? Who are now focused on and have an opinion about who is equipped to run the company in which I have invested in my portfolio of companies. And there's some more support in this area. There's some more pressure there as startups and this ecosystem of VC money and entrepreneurs founding companies, raising money, not having to bootstrap. There's still that going on, but there's more availability of, despite last year, there's more availability of capital now than there was 10, 15 years ago. So there's a whole new crop of companies coming up, which is fantastic. I love that, by the way. I think that's amazing. So as this, I say, matures and develops, there's more scrutiny from employees, like I said, from investors, from other players to be better at management, right? For entrepreneurs to learn those leadership skills. I would like to make a case for more CMO to CEO transitions because of shit like this, to be honest. So I think CMOs and marketers in general have, if you've gotten to a certain level and you've worked in marketing and comms long enough, there are some things that you just know how to do, which really lend themselves well to entrepreneurship. You likely know how to work with high uncertainty, the threat of your budget being taken away by the BD team at any moment, right? Things like that happen to marketers all of the time. If you've been a CMO long enough, CMOs have the shortest tenure of anybody in the C-suite. So you probably know how to land, figure out who your stakeholders are, chop and change quickly, right? No, normally diametrically opposed to the CMO is the CFO. So like, there's just some skills that you have learned if you've been in marketing leadership long enough. And I think that lends itself really well to being a CEO in a lot of cases for entrepreneurs. The other thing that you do have.
Sorry.
No,
Before you go on, I just want to jump on that. So do you see that with it? We mentioned obviously Bankman-Fried and talking about him as a technical entrepreneurial kind of founder, if you like, that maybe lacked some of that leadership skill. How does a technical founder like that sort of, what's it that they're missing from the experience that a CMO would have going into a CEO or a leadership role?
So one thing that Sam Bankman-Fried did have and cultivated really well, and you could argue that his personal branding and his personal marketing was really successful, right? He was a charismatic leader that managed to get a lot of people behind him, probably starting with his technical brilliance and acumen and vision. So if we're just talking pure marketing, that was a success, I would say, until it wasn't. So then we're talking about just the maturity to know how to run a business. So in this case, the I don't remember his exact title. The person who worked on Enron, shutting down Enron and doing an audit of that business, then came in to do the same audit on FTX and said basically it was worse than Enron, right? Which in modern history is like, oh, geez, that's like corporate malfeasance extreme, right? And he said FTX was worse than that. So then there's just the marketing part of things, but then there's just the wherewithal and the maturity to say, I don't really know how to run a business. I need to surround myself with a C-suite that does know how to run a business, and then I need to listen to them. So if this is, and again, this is like, if you have your own private company and you're not holding customer deposits and you're not regulated by the FCA or the SEC or anybody, you have more leeway in terms of what you do and how you run your business. He went into like a very, very shady business that courted a lot of scrutiny and didn't manage his business well from the beginning, it sounds like. So this was going to blow up at some point anyway. So I think the maturity to say, okay, I have the vision. I know how to set up this product set or this solution set, but the business of running a business, I don't know yet, and I need help there, which is fine.
And on that point, Amber, coming back to your point about the case for CMOs making good CEOs, is the fact that CMOs inherently, marketing inherently is often about listening and about sort of understanding and appreciating perspectives and motivations, etc. And by listening, that enables us to be better leaders in terms of incorporating different points of view.
Yes. In short, yes. I would go even further to say anyone who's done marketing for long enough is basically an armchair psychologist, right? We have to get into the hearts and minds and shoes of our audience really quickly, figure out what motivates them, the audience, figure out what makes them move, what they're afraid of, their pain points, their aspirations. We have to do this quickly. You have to write copy. You have to do appeal to different audiences and quickly. So yeah, that's a lot of what being a CEO is figuring out who are the parties involved, what are the stakeholders, what are their motivations, what is the right path forward, and then making decisions quickly, and sometimes unpopular decisions to say this is the way that we're going. And I think marketing leaders, CMOs specifically, have a career of having to do that.
In fact, yeah, okay, perfect. I think that was much better advanced way of describing that listening is an important sort of asset to have as a CMO moving into a CEO position. Let me ask you for your sort of broader take on, obviously we're talking about ethical and responsible practice here. Thinking about from an ePOP perspective, looking at instances like the FTX sort of scandal, or I think you used the term saga at the beginning, which I think is a much nicer way of putting it. What's your take on how fintech can, as an industry, sort of look to again mitigate and compensate for these sorts of big malpractices occurring moving forward?
Sure. Well, fintech in general, I think, is in a really nice place right now. It's in it's a space where, when fintech came about, it was like, first it was met with a lot of suspicion by incumbents, so big banks and big financial services, to say, oh my God, they're trying to take, they can move faster than we can, because if you've ever worked in a bank, you know that it is just a labyrinth. Whatever bank it is, whatever big bank, it's a labyrinth of legacy systems from front end to back end. It's very hard to move quickly. It's very hard to even centralize things like data, to move something from a trading desk back to a chief risk officer or a risk function in the back end. It's really, really tough. And so fintech's coming in, it was like, oh, we have to squash these guys. This is not good. For a while there, fintech was innovating on the front end, but couldn't do anything differently really on the back end. So there were a lot of legacy rails, like for payments. Fintechs were using Swift still, or MasterCard, because that's why these guys are incumbents, is because they've done the work to lay the pipe to have all of these international global systems that are not easily replaced. So now, fast forward, many years, I'd say almost 20 years now, fintech is a part of financial services. It's part of business. You see financial services, big companies buying fintechs or innovating themselves. They're looking for new ideas now. They're looking at how to improve the customer experience. They're looking how to improve operations. They're looking for that. So there's a whole, I'd say, ecosystem of not just fintechs, but fintech enablers, consulting businesses. There's a whole ecosystem that's started up as a result of that. So I think if fintech in general is at a good place, and it's embedded, and there's an expectation, which is not the same for cryptocurrency yet. There are a couple of things that I think are really important to fintech going forward, and that the industry has either mastered or is mastering. One is respecting consumer privacy. So this issue, I think, is super, super important. It's treated differently in different parts of the world. And this goes beyond just like the US, that doesn't have anything like GDPR nationally. There are certain states that have pretty stringent data protection rules and laws, but there's nothing like GDPR. It goes more than just like asking for consent. It really goes into, how do you utilize people's individual data that they generate all of the time? How do you give them more control from the footprint that they leave with every interaction on any device? So that's one. I'm going to skip terms like honesty and transparency, because those are really loaded.
Okay.
You want to say something? Go on.
No, I was just going to ask you, like, from an ePOP perspective, I mean, like, as you perfectly sort of introduced things at the beginning, like, what are the key considerations in terms of how you're building trust with your users, your vendors, your customers regarding their use of data or their way that the data is managed?
That's a good question, and I would love to answer that question. So ePOP from the beginning, one of our principles, our guiding principles, is that individual consumers should have more control and more benefit, not just control over, but benefit from all of this information that our digital footprint that is growing every day with every interaction online. So what does that mean? That means not just having to hand over all of our contact details, all of our information to retailers to do I don't know what with it. And again, I'm a marketer. I've been through waves of marketing. I know what businesses do on the other end when they get a hold of this information. And this goes to responsible marketing. So we sit in the middle. Consumers come to us. They are able to have a bespoke experience, right? So based on their actual spending, reductions, promotions, points, rewards based on their actual spending, but they have a layer between them and retail. So even down to things like, we give all of our users, a bespoke email address that they can use with merchants. So, if you go to a coffee shop and they've got a cool Square terminal or an iPad terminal, and you could say, how do you want your receipt? I don't want my receipt. I want it emailed to me. I want it sent to me by text, right? We have an email address that you can put in there, and your receipt pops up on your app, and you're not exposed to marketing promotions, spam. You're not exposed to that. So there's a layer in between, but because we see your actual spend, there's actual benefit, not just like suppose like, okay, this woman is roughly in the demographic of 25 to 55-year-olds. Therefore, let's send her some blind things that she might want, but based on your actual spend. So I see you buy this every single month. How about, do you want a discount on that thing that you actually buy every single month? So there's a benefit to providing your data.
And are you, Amber, I'm just going to put you up on that one point as well. Like, so are you guys like, are you completely transparent with your customers about this is how we use your data? And because what you've just described to me there is, it's like, you're my shopping assistant in essence.
Oh, I love that. Yes, this is an aspiration of ours, especially as things like generative AI become more accessible for companies like us. We can integrate that and then say, great, not only it doesn't have to have a person saying, okay, I want to do this promotion, so let me grab this piece of data, et cetera, but it generates things, promotions and deals and discounts automatically, right? Based on what your activity is and is bespoke to you. And I think that's super important. And this is something that we do tell our users. We don't have that ability yet to do it with generatively with Gen AI yet, but that's something that we do tell our users. This is how, this is what you see. This is the information that we're collecting, and this is how it's being used.
God, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to jump on ePOP myself. Amber, I'm where, can you believe we've already had like a 50-minute conversation? We try and keep them to 45 minutes. I feel like there are so many more things we could talk about. You were going through, just before I ask you for the kind of concluding piece of advice, you were going through your list. You were talking about data, keen to get what those other elements were, and then maybe we can
Sure.
go from there.
Let me be a little bit less verbose, because as I said, I am an extrovert and I love talking about this particular subject. The other one that I think is really important to mention is the sustainability and social responsibility as marketers, right? So there's a lot we can do. I'm thinking not just for the environment, but things like there's a demand for more inclusivity in marketing, cause-based marketing, educational campaigns, community engagement. There's a lot of things that marketing can control. And this goes back to, what is the place of marketing in the world? Is it just, chilling for a company? Well, there's a lot more that marketing does and can do, especially now, because marketing, what is marketing now? Is it everything external facing for a company? Like, marketing is very blurry and encompasses so much, from demand generation to performance marketing to advertising. Like, marketing is a lot of things. The last thing that I would say is certainly to avoid deceptive practices, and terms like honesty, transparency, deceptive. Those are all very loaded and hard to pin down, and it really depends on who you are, what company you work for, and everybody's comfort level with defining all of these things or not defining them. So now there is, regulatory oversight over of false advertising, misleading claims, manipulation of information, and there should be. So there's a lot of daylight between getting in trouble with a regulator and being completely transparent. Like, there's a lot of daylight in between. So you just need to figure out, as marketers, where are you on this scale, on this dial? Where is your company? Do you need to push that forward? Like, how do you, there's a lot of daylight between those two things. So as marketers, we figure out where we need to be and where our message needs to be.
That was absolutely brilliant. I feel like that last, well, the whole thing, to be honest, but that is such a brilliant piece of kind of practical advice, if you like, for any of our listeners that are sat there thinking, right, as you say, where are we on that continuum, and where do we need to, what are we trying to do in order to move ourselves along that dial, if you like? Fantastic. Amber, let me ask you for your final. We like to conclude all of our episodes by sort of taking, I guess back to the beginnings of their careers. I think it's fascinating thinking about your pivot from journalism to corporate communications and marketing. But what's that kind of bit of advice you would have offered to your younger self that you think would be really valuable to you personally, to help you kind of develop your career further?
So, in terms of what advice I would offer my younger self, there's one thing that really, lots of things, but one thing that I think is more important than any others for me in my case, which is don't dwell so much on what doesn't go right. Certainly, when I was young, it was really hard for me to understand or know which events will throw my life into a completely different direction and which events were non-important. And as you get older, you understand that it almost doesn't matter because we control so little about the big lines of our lives anyway. And not to say that nothing that we do matters, but most of our life is down to chance, especially how those first 10 to 15 years unfold, right? So you're a kid, it's so important in terms of setting a foundation for who you are as a person, but you have like very little control over that. And entrepreneur types, especially, don't really like that. The idea that you don't control your outcomes, weekly or daily, right? There's like that's I would say large in general terms, it's a common trait of entrepreneurs, myself included. But not being able to control or at least strongly influence the outcomes of what you do, that goes against a lot of entrepreneurial thinking. So when I say don't dwell so much on what doesn't go right, there are really two. Go on.
I was going to ask you, Amber. Like, I'd
Yeah.
love to. I tell you what, it's a piece of advice we've not had anyone else highlight, which I think is
Really?
really, really interesting. Can you give us an example? Can you give us an example? Like, there was in that moment of your career where you think you got really hung up on something and it affected you, that in terms of you wish you'd perhaps had that broader perspective that you've just described.
So many things that it's like, okay, I didn't get this campaign did not perform the way I needed it to, or it didn't hit our target, or actually this whole department was downsized, or I was asked to move, relocate, or any small to large thing that you think this is the end of the world. And of course it's all relative based on your lived experience, but thinking, God, this is it for me. I'm done in this career. There was one webinar. I was working for a pretty conservative financial services firm, and we were doing a webinar with one of our researchers, and it was a live webinar, and somebody wrote in and said the audio didn't work. It turns out, so I thought the audio didn't work for the entire audience, and it turns out that that person just didn't have a speaker on. But I stopped the webinar to reconnect everything while it was live, and in doing so I yelled fuck on a live webcast to a very conservative, set of folks. I thought I was done. And, the head researcher just thought it was hilarious. So things like that, where you think, oh my, and that, of course, I unpacked that in my mind for a month afterwards. And that cost me so much anguish. And it was a non event in the end. So things like that. So many examples of things like that. But, we have so little time on Earth. So decades just fly by, and in the blink of an eye, it's done. So that's a big one that I would say. Don't dwell so much on things that don't go right.
Amber, that is some absolute genius. And I love the fact that you weren't to know when you were, jumping in with the exclamation of fuck on the webinar, that years later you'd be sat on a podcast episode recalling it and probably giving us our headline and focus. So perfect. Amber, it was an absolute delight from my end. Thank you so much for giving us an hour or so of your time. It's been brilliant. As I say, we'll after we finish, we'll try and see if we can pry you on to another episode. But thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's really fun. I would love to come back and keep talking about marketing.
Excellent. Thanks, Amber.
Bye.